Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to try to make a really big and floofy skirt out of tulle. I've always wanted to do something like this and I thought the time had come. I got a lot of tulle. I got this one and this and this. I got 3 bolts. In total, this is 120 yards. And for the lining, I got this satin fabric. This is the wrong side, but on the other side, it's shiny like satin is supposed to be. And I was going to get 3.5 yards, but I ended up getting 4 because there was a little bit extra left on the bolt and I could get 50% off if I got that. I have never used this much fabric for any project I've ever made, so I am so excited to make this. I just really hope it turns out good. If you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel and comment down below anything else you want to see me make. And without further ado, let's get started. I started by making the bodice because I predicted it to be the less time-consuming part. Since it was a pretty simple design, I could have just measured myself and made it like that, but I've been really wanting to use this technique where I put masking tape all over myself and mark out how I want the pattern to be. And it turned out really good because it ensures that it fits perfectly to your body, but it was really hard to do the back on myself, but I managed using some mirrors. Once all the pieces were cut out, I transferred it to paper and added seam allowance, and with it I cut 2 sets of the pattern from the satin for the outside and inside of the bodice. And since the satin has a dull side and a shiny side, I made the inside of the bodice dull and the outside shiny just so that it would look more like a lining and a main piece. Then I pinned together all the side seams except the back and just sewed it all up using a regular straight stitch. And again, I did this 2 times to get 2 sets of the bodice. And this is what they looked like once that was done. I know the top one looked smaller and I got worried, but they were actually the exact same size when I put them on top of each other. I went on to making the tulle overlay, so I got some of my tulle that was a bit longer than the length of the bodice and gathered it on the machine. To do this, I used the highest tension with the longest stitch length and kept on gathering until I had a length long enough to go from end to end on the bodice. Looking back, I think it might have made it easier to gather both ends, but I only gathered one end and it worked out in the end. Then I pinned the tulle to the bodice and smoothed it out so that it was laying how I wanted it to and that all the gathers were even. I sewed all around the edges, making sure to stay within my seam allowance. Then I cut the top part that was sticking out because I didn't need that part anymore. Then I needed to add boning, so I sewed it onto the lining of the bodice, which is the one without the tulle on it. I sewed it on all the seam allowances and made sure to round out the corners before I sewed it on so that it won't poke through the fabric. I also made it short enough so that I can still sew along the top and bottom later on. Next, I cut out a long strip of fabric which I folded in half and sewed wrong sides out so that I can turn it right sides out with a paper clip. This is to make all the loops for the lace-up back. Then I took a little break to make my crochet orders, which were 3 pillows and a ladybug. Now back to the dress. This is what the strip of fabric should look like now, and I cut it up into 10 equal pieces to put 5 on each side of the back. If you want more or less, feel free to make how many ever you want. These are what my 10 pieces looked like, and before I attached them, I thought it would be a good time to sew in my tag. I really like how when I put this in, everyone knows that it was made by me. I sewed it into one of the inner corners of the lining and put it in by sewing all around the tag with a straight stitch. And for the loops, I spaced them evenly apart along the back of the bodice and pinned them so that the loop part was facing towards the bodice and the ends were lining up with the edge of the back. Once I did one side, I used that as a guide to do the other side to make sure that both sides were even. I pinned them securely like this. And then I put the other bodice piece on top so that the right sides were facing each other. And I sewed along the sides and top, which also sews the loops in place so that they can't come out. But looking back, I should have just sewed the top so that I could understitch the lining to the seam allowance and then sew the sides, because it made understitching way harder when I sewed the 3 sides already. I could remove the pins and cut the corner so that I could turn it right side out, and it was looking so good. I was so happy with how it was looking. And I realized that I would need to add boning to where the loops were, because if I didn't, the fabric would scrunch up when I tightened it, so I made sure to do that. Then I understitched the top, which is where you fold the seam allowance towards the lining and top stitch it so that the lining and the side with the tool stay where they're supposed to. As I mentioned before, it would have been a lot easier to do this earlier, but oh well, it ended up working out, so it's fine. That completes the bodice, and this is how it looked like. And now on to the skirt. Originally, I wanted to make a full circle skirt, but I didn't have enough fabric for that, so I made as much of a circle as I could, which I think ended up being about 3/4 of a circle. So it was basically a 3/4 circle skirt. But I like that I had to do that because it actually ended up being really big. So if it had been a full circle, it would have been even bigger and even harder to work with, because towards the end it was so heavy that I could barely get it through the sewing machine. And I still had to piece the skirt together, so once I cut out the pieces, I sewed it together so that there was only one seam along the back. And satin does fray quite easily, so I made a French seam for this part. After hemming the bottom, I put the bolts of tulle up the skirt to decide how long I wanted the tulle layers to be. And I decided that I liked the length of half the bolt, so I cut the bolt in half. I don't know if this was the best way to do it, but it was definitely faster than cutting it yard by yard. It wasn't even all the way through, but I think it's fine because you can't really see it in the final piece. And I also forgot that one side of the fabric was folded, so I ended up having to cut that in half yard by yard, but it's fine. I just kind of go with the flow. And to gather them up, I used the same method as the bodice, where I used the longest stitch length with the highest tension. And I did this for a pretty long time until I had enough gathers to go all around the bottom of the skirt. I lined the tulle up as best as I could so that the edge of the tulle lined up with the edge of the lining, but the tulle was so fluffy it was hard to tell exactly where it ended. And in case you're wondering why my hair is all crinkly, just because I came back from a cheer competition where we braid our hair and cover it with hairspray. So yeah, that's why. Anyways, I ended up measuring about 30 centimeters from the bottom and pinning it there. Then I sewed on it, securing the tulle in place. It was also at this point that I realized I forgot to put interfacing in the bodice, so I flipped it wrong side out and ironed it the best I could. This is definitely not the ideal way to do it. You should do it before you sew anything, but I forgot to do so. So, I mean, what could I do? And this is also very unlike me because I add interfacing to everything. And this is me cutting the bolt of tulle in half. It did something to my scissors and I can't cut as precisely with it anymore ever since doing this. So if you have anything else you could use to do this, I would recommend using that instead. And back to making all the gathers and layers of tulle for the skirt, I repeated what I demonstrated earlier of making the layers after layers until I got to the top of the skirt. It's kind of nice because the circumference gets smaller and smaller, so it gets faster and faster to do each layer. And once I reached the top, I looked at the skirt and felt like there wasn't enough. It just looked too sparse. Plus, I had way too much tulle left over, so I made even more gathers and added more layers in between the previous layers. And next, we have a brief intermission to go to cheerleading state finals.
Put it down! Put it down!
I hope you enjoyed that, and now back to the video. As I was saying, I had to go back in and add more layers between that were already there, and I don't recommend doing this because the tool really gets in the way. So if you're making it, make sure that you have dense enough layers from the beginning. I know it doesn't look like it took that long, but this was definitely the part that took up the bulk of the time making this dress. And I am telling you, the dress was so heavy by this point, I could barely get it through the sewing machine. It just kept wanting to drag itself off the table, and I was scared the fabric was gonna rip or something. But finally, after weeks, when the skirt was finally done, I decided to try it on, and I was so excited by how it was looking. It was just as big and floofy as I imagined. And now that all the tulle was in place, I needed to add the zipper. I sewed it in just like you would any other regular zipper, and since I didn't have a pink zipper, I just used the closest color I had, which was white, and I think it worked out fine because it was an invisible zipper, so you can't really see it anyways, especially under all those layers of tulle. But considering how heavy the skirt was, it was extremely hard to sew it in because the skirt just kept dragging down, and it took me way longer than it should have. And I couldn't even sit on the chair, so I had to stand awkwardly while I sewed it in. And finally, I could put the skirt and bodice together. I was so excited for this, and to do this, I made sure they were centered and sewed them right size together. And at this point, I was so frustrated trying to sew this using the sewing machine, but I didn't really have another choice, so I just suffered through it. And to finish off the edge, I bound it with some pink bias binding. And so I could actually wear the dress, I had to make the lacing for the back, which I did by taking a long strip of fabric, sewing it wrong size together, and turning it right size out to make a long thing. It was the same thing I did to make the lace-up loops, except I didn't cut them up. And now the dress was officially wearable, so I tried it on, and the dress would be complete based on my original design, but I really felt like it was missing something, so I consulted my sister, and we concluded that I should add a ruffle that went all along the top of the bodice and around my shoulders. It worked out perfectly because I still had plenty of tulle left, so I folded it so it would have 4 layers and ruffled it along the middle. I just did this until I had a length that would be long enough to go all the way around the bodice from one side of the back all the way to the other, plus some room for my arms to go. Then I pinned it onto the dress to see how I would like it, and it definitely looked so much better than before. I hand sewed this portion because that would just be a lot easier, and it would also just make it look a lot better. I tried it on again, and it still felt like something was missing. So I went to my mom this time and asked her for her advice, and she said it would look better with some flowers. I thought this was a great idea, especially because I had some extra of the lining fabric that I didn't really know what to do with. So to make them, I cut out a long rectangle and folded one side to the other so it was purposefully uneven and sewed all the way across. I tried out a few different ways of gathering it, but hand gathering ended up working the best, so that's what I did. I gathered it until I felt like it was good. Then I rolled it up and sewed it so that it looked like a rose. I tried out a few variations, like making it with tulle, and then I made one with tulle on top of the satin and then making it to a rose. But I liked the plain satin one the best, so I made as many of them as I could with the fabric I had left over, and made the rest with tulle so that I would have enough flowers. To be honest, while I was making them, I had no idea where to put them on the dress. I wasn't sure if I should put them on the skirt or the bodice or somewhere else. But then I thought that if I put it on the skirt, it would probably weigh down the tulle and make the skirt not look as fluffy. And then I tried pinning it along the waistline of the bodice and on the shoulder ruffle, and I thought that that looked pretty good, so that's where I ended up putting them. And here I'm seeing where it would look best to place. I originally wanted all the flowers to be made of the satin fabric, but since I didn't have enough, I did every other one in tulle, and I think it still ended up looking pretty good, so I'm happy with it. And I also put a few on the ruffle, which I think gave it a nice touch. And to secure it to the dress, I was going to sew them on, but after doing the first one, I realized that that was going to be very difficult. So after halfway through the second one, I decided to just glue them on. I normally don't really like using glue to make clothes, but I feel like in this case, it was the better option because it was just really hard for the needle to go through and you would see a lot of stitches on the inside of the dress. But I did still sew the flowers on the shoulder ruffle so that I wouldn't be left with hard chunks of glue in the tulle. And after gluing them all on, I had to wait at least 24 hours and then it was all done. Oh yeah, but then I realized that I had an extra row, so I just put it in the middle of the bodice. And this is how it turned out! I am so happy with how it looks, and I feel like an absolute princess when I wear it. All the hours I put into this was so worth it, and I'm so proud to have made something like this. This is definitely the biggest project I've ever made, and if you made it to the end of the video, you are amazing, and I hope you stick around for future projects. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and see you next time!